Well, good morning, Julie.
Good morning, Ed.
This is Ed
Oh,
Reith.
sorry.
That's
Afternoon.
well, I was going to clarify that for our listeners. Julie Anderson in Australia and Ed Reither in America in Taos. So it's Julie's morning and Ed's afternoon. So good morning.
And good afternoon.
Yeah. How are you? We haven't had a recording in what seems to be a long time for me anyway, considering our dialogues over the years. So
Mm,
I wanted to start a topic that may continue on to other recordings or sessions, we might call them, about your time with Adi Da.
yeah.
Now, some of the discussions that we've been having, and this connects to a larger topic, is the nature of Adi Da as consciousness as and also the process of being about consciousness as a primary um, dimension of his work and also the devotee's work in self-understanding and devotion and also then to the higher levels of practice. So,
Okay.
okay, so I remember you mentioning a time when you were on the island in Naitumba in an early period of your relationship with him, and you were speaking about you as a devotional practitioner, meaning that you had more of a way of faith practice, and I may be using language that is limited to Adida's um, uh, method, if you will. Um, But one of the profound times that you spoke to me about was when you were sitting on a beach on the island reading the knee of listening. And that at that time, in that moment, something was awakened in you.
Mm,
And I thought maybe we could start our topic tonight about what was it that was awakened in you when you were asked to study, or you took it on yourself to revisit a book that you were very familiar with, obviously. This is
mm.
not something you had first just picked up in 1984 or 5 or whatever this period of time is. But there was something about you going back and revisiting the knee of listening.
Mm, mm. Okay. Yeah,
So, so
sure.
if you could share the circumstance that brought you back to this moment on the beach and studying the knee of listening.
All right. Yep. I'd love to. Thank you for asking. The so this was the event the time you're speaking of is after 1986.
Okay.
um, I don't remember the specific timing, but it was after we had come back from the yajna.
So
uh,
this is post divine emergence period.
yes, 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 when the four kanyas were dressed in white, and we had what was really an extraordinary time of uh, intimacy with him and his daughters, the brahmacharinis, and a very uh, not only sacred gurukula, but also what felt to be a real culture. Um, and and even on the island, it was an ecstatic time and a very wonderfully full process with him. And prior to 1986, and even during this period of time once again, the name that he had given me was Remembrance. I was Kanya Remembrance. And all throughout the years, and what drew me to him was falling in love with his being, with his person, with his transmission. Um, so I was a bhakti, devotion, just remembrance of him was putting on the guru, as it's understood in traditional terms, meaning that guru enters devotee. The remembrance is so potent that it's a non-difference form of devotion, so that there's only the realization of his divine transmission. And of course, responsibility then is the sadhana, to be able to then grow in that process of the gift that is given. And in being a woman who was with him intimately, in service to him bodily, of course that magnified that devotion, because the touch, the actual tangible touch, was very tangible. And the transmission was so potent in being able to serve him bodily, serve his environment, serve his temples, attend to him in any way, attend to those who are dear to him, to his devotees, to his process. And it was ecstatic, as I've described it, ecstatic tapas. And but then also, as was necessary during this period of time, it was an intensive review and testing and proving time of the nature of our relationship to him and our process, and what our true maturity was in relationship to him. And so he was working with me, as always, relative to the limitations of this bodily persona in terms of gross and subtle terms and dramatizations of egoity, the ego act and patterning. And one of the things that he indicated to me was that the force of my egoity and the energy that I represented was so big and strong that he would tell me that he felt that I was hunting him, as if I was a predator.
In your devotion.
In my devotion and in emotional sexual terms, in every aspect of my being, there was such a fierceness in relationship to him, but it was not rightly aligned. I was going to use the word pure, but it wasn't wholly auspicious, even though I was madly in love. But there was the flip side of all of the baggage that went along with it, that hadn't been purified sufficiently to be able to be in right relationship to assume responsibility for what he was giving me.
So could I just interpret that to say that you were in a real, truly devotional relationship to him, but there were aspects to your being, whether they be on various levels, that were not fully inspected or purified, that you were just really out front of yourself, devoting yourself to an other, if you will.
Yes, yes. And this is an important point that you're making, because the experiential phenomena or samadhi of jnana samadhi, forms of nirvikalpa or savakalpa samadhi, these various experiences didn't, just because you had them, or even if they could be sustained for long periods of time, did not mean that the necessary process of insight, self-understanding, self-transcending yoga, and responsibility and maturity was actually stabilized, so that the process about hearing and seeing and reception was happening.
Right. So just to clarify for the listen, so your devotion was not just necessarily through a murti or through his bodily human form, which it included that, but now you're speaking about a more of a higher level of devotion in terms of meditation and higher level samadhis. Those,
Yes,
yeah,
yes.
right.
Yes, of course, because being around him bodily or learning about the traditions of devotion through ceremonial and ritual practices never replaced the consistent communication that he made that the process occurs in his transmission. It's all about transmission yoga and his specific transmission.
So
Unique.
if I may just try to understand it, and from my point of view, is that transmission, which goes beyond his bodily human form, which is more in terms of an energetic process,
Mm,
which naturally rises the awareness up through the channels in the body and into the subtler and the more, if you will, causal, the different dimensions that he speaks to in the third, the fourth, the fifth, and the sixth stages of life. So you're speaking in those terms in
um,
devotion.
so you're suggesting that by virtue of being in his company, these things become obvious.
Or you're gifted, or if you follow his energy, if you will be elevated to these levels of awareness.
Possibly, it depends
Possibly.
upon the psychophysical patterning of each individual.
But
During the
for your case,
yeah,
you
yeah,
you had these, if you will, you were gifted with these samadhis that you were referring to, or
yes,
yeah,
yes,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
quite frequently. I mean, it was I didn't do anything to cause these things. I mean, of course, sometimes I did because, there was intensive study of the traditions, relative to what we call conductivity, but it's yoga, in terms of how you manipulate the energies in the psychophysical being and in the Kundalini process. And
So I do want to go back to the period on the beach, but I just want to clarify that your devotion included these kinds of, if you will, experiences that you were drawn to, but in his criticism, he was
yes,
also saying there was a grasping in that there was a an object that you were going to
exactly. Yeah.
identifying with him, right?
Yeah. Yes, yes. And this is post teaching years, okay? So this is what you're describing is a bit different than the manner in which he would actually create these events
Right,
as
right,
described in Garbage
right,
and the Goddess, okay?
right.
Where he would give these and take them away, this type of thing. The way that he worked after the divine self-emergence was actually different than that.
Right,
Like these experiential phenomena were not like given and then taken away.
right,
Like these were insights and experiential phenomena that were became aware in feeling awareness or the conscious being by virtue of devotion. It's
right.
like you can even say, as he describes the sunlight over the well. The creepy crawlies are not necessarily just ugly, dark things. There also can be the distractions by any kind of phenomena through which the seeker is trying to be liberated from the position within which it seems to be trapped.
Right.
you know so yes, his sunlight over the well and then the devotion
Right.
to his transmission brings into awareness all these aspects of what he has called the psychobiography of the ego. Mm.
So in this blessing phase where he's not playing this kind of role of transmission and taking it away to demonstrate the garbage in the goddess time, if you will, but to go back to the beach. Now you're in this position.
Yeah,
You have a deep intimacy with him and a long history.
yeah,
You're devotionally, and he's giving you criticisms about your hunting, the guru,
yeah,
if you will.
Yes, yes.
So you go back into his early writings, the knee of listening.
Yes. And the reason that I did this is because of noticing that no matter how much I loved him, the relationship still wasn't right. I wasn't making right use of him. And he was making this very clear to me. And one of the ways he made this clear to me is that because of this hunting that was occurring at gross, subtle, and then manifesting in a not being able to rest in the depth of his being and his person, is that I needed to continue to maintain a celibate sadhana. And this tapas then um, turned everything back on me, you know, in terms of me being frustrated with my impulse to engage what I felt I needed in that intimacy with him. Because being bodily intimate with him or engaging in any form of bodily service with him, it immediately sensitized me to him. Yet he was saying, not enough, not enough, not enough. Something is obstructing what you are doing with me. So that's what precipitated my studying the knee of listening and feeling, okay, prayer of remembrance, bhakti, gopi, lover, perfect remembrance. That's all that. The prayer of remembrance, the mantras, the malas, the beads, the form of meditation. Um, okay, insight, radical understanding, back to the basics, back to the uniqueness of his criticism of what obstructs resting in him, the bright. In studying the knee of listening that day on the beach, it was a retreat day, which we had all often, regularly. And as I was reading this, feeling his process, and as he describes so humanly and so intimately his ordeal, and where, as he was continually making clear his understanding of the errors and always being guided by the bright, and then at a certain point, radical understanding and insight and the liberation in that, the fist and the open hand and that radical understanding, and then his confession of being after his pilgrimage in India and the objectification relative to the gurus that he was in relationship to and the guides and all of the phenomena that he experienced. He indicated that, and in the Vedanta temple event, the non-difference of the context within which his whole process was arising, which is the consciousness domain, the bright conscious light itself. And that struck me. And it not only struck me mentally, it went all the way through understanding why I was being given this particular form of tapas, of the austerity of celibacy, intensive study, intensive meditation, lots of time in the hall. I was still attending him bodily, but I felt his transmission through understanding his process, that it wasn't until he was no longer objectified.
Right. So to get to that place, you have to develop or understand, you have to go through that self-understanding. You have to see the mechanisms within
Yeah.
your own psyche
Yes.
that is what he might call the listening and the hearing
Exactly.
parts.
Exactly. Yes.
Right.
Yes. And important to note that this was post-divine self-emergence, and as we spoke about in our last dialogue, that process was a gift that was given spontaneously based upon the relationship having been engaged for quite a long time prior to that, but the gift of being established as the witness. And through his process of coming all the way down into the cosmic domain, his descent, that then establishing the process in the consciousness domain. Now, this links to what I'm describing because he's allowing me, by the tapas that he's giving me, to go beyond my own personal liabilities, to be able to become more consciously responsible for the fact that the process occurs in the consciousness domain.
Right. Right. This is key. Right.
Yeah, and it's not about the aggressive seeking of any kind, whether it's the neuroses of I want to own you because I love you more than anybody else and you're mine, and I want you to love me more than anybody else. You know, the duality dynamic that we play.
Right. Now, so I can follow you, for me, you're now mentioning the surrender process that this whole sadhana centers on, this surrendering of these faculties, these self-referential identities, subtle, gross, and causal.
Yes,
Right.
precisely.
So it's not like you're getting an insight. It's actually you giving up.
Exactly. That's what freeing of energy and attention is all about. And that is also occurs not through effort, but through surrender, as you're describing.
Right.
Yes.
True, as he puts a
True.
capital with
Yes.
the capital T.
Yes. And true surrender is also equivalent to remembrance. It's the same process.
Well, you actually had that named also in
Yes.
addition to remembrance. You had surrender.
Yeah.
Right.
So yes, which would be a wonderful conversation at some point, the names, because these names were blessings that had both aspects to it also. Was a blessing of acknowledging some form of maturity or insight or growth, but also they were a limit, reflecting something about the great tradition, because as he said, all of the traditions have only foreshadowed the culminating process of his revelation.
Right.
Yeah, so, but yes, so this moment was very significant because I remember I wrote, obviously, when there would be significant moments in the process in which and the significant moments coincided with an ecstasy of gratitude. You know, I would want to express the gift of greater understanding and maturity and capability for what was being given through this process of yielding and surrender to him as my Satguru. You know, that was the entire process, no matter how I related to him. And the heart yearning to be consistently one with him
Right.
has never ceased, no matter what has ever occurred to this day. It's
Right.
always been that fervor, because there is nothing even remotely comparable or satisfying in the changing domain of cosmic happenings
Right.
at all, no matter how profound they are. There is nothing, because if you are in that context and identified with it, it's always changing, and that impermanence is suffering.
And you also see that all of this emanates from that.
Yes, in when as a realization.
Right.
Yes,
Right. Right.
that can be intuited. That can be intuited, but the sadhana must be done in order for that to be most fully realized.
Right. That purification.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yeah. So and it's an extraordinary ordeal, and
So
it
you so
never ends.
so you wrote him and you were expressing the deep
Yes,
the
yes.
deepening
Yeah, yeah.
of your understanding through the self understanding that you're now being given.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And immediately when you say that, there are a couple other events that during this period of time that relate to this understanding, because it points to these two things I can tell you, two ways that he worked with me during this time, was all about the context within which the process in relationship to him was occurring, no matter what we were doing. And one was this matter of embracing celibacy. Okay. Now, as you would imagine, my emotional sexual history is littered with all sorts of outside the square interests, and not being, for lack of a better word, uptight and prudish, you know. However, as we know, there we're always of two minds, the emotional sexual persona. So there's a flip side to everything. There's a lot of nuances that you actually have to understand about how you operate.
Yeah.
And for maturity, which he says that it has to occur in order for the disposition of love to be love and be able to receive love, to be stabilized, must be there. So here I am, and one of the things that I remember most vividly is that because, even though I was given the discipline of celibacy, I still attended to him bodily. I was his principal masseur, and I, when he wasn't unwell, and other ladies had served them too, the other Kanyas served them too, but we all had a unique way of doing that, which created an order of a fullness that was able to, he indicated, was the beginning of the true mandala of a right relationship to him.
Right.
And so in that context, I would also still sleep with him and attend to him in, throughout the night. And I have to tell you, I never slept when I attended him as he seemed to sleep. And this is the point that I want to make, is that the force of his presence and being was so alive and awake as he apparently slept. And because there were no words spoken, and because there was no exchange going on, and we weren't like, as we slept, sort of like a couple wrapped up in one another, like you might see, or people might sleep sometimes. We had, when it was sleep, it was his process. And what it felt like lying next to him, no exchanges of a familiarity or ordinary persona. I tell you, worlds were being transformed, and you could literally feel this, and you could hear him speak. You could see him sweat. You could feel and see actually the effulgence from his form, even as he might utter things or make sounds or movements or whatever. It was extraordinary to be with him, and I was awake in his process as we apparently slept. That was not my doing,
No, I
and
hear you.
yeah. And so oftentimes I was, hold on, two shakes. Oftentimes I was so awake that I didn't want to disturb him on the bed physically. And also because my own subjectivity was going on in the midst of being aware of this being, this profound siddha that I was lying next to. And there's the chatter of my own emotional, psychophysical being going on with this celibacy and the energy that I was having to conduct because I couldn't engage him in the
Right.
same way. And so before you know it, I'm on the floor, sitting up, in a meditative asana with, give it over, like feeling like my thoughts and emotions are boomeranging off the walls, and I'm probably disturbing his sleep. And my God, it's like a kind of a madness. But then as the yielding, in the yoga in relationship to him, it would always came to rest. It always came to rest. And the only residual thing that I had to deal with was feeling guilt or shame about the fact of what I seemed to be as a disturbance. Pain in the ass was a common reference, you know, too much, too this or too that, and chill out. And so this celibacy did this, and that was really an important necessity for me to be able to let go of that urge, that seeking urge, and that need, that neediness,
Right.
for connection that can only be satisfied through the depth process of being in his domain.
And you mentioned that there was another moment.
Yes. Yeah. So we would meditate with him regularly, quite a bit, every morning, early. And we would, dark, 4 o'clock, for good time for meditation, stillness, depth of the night. And we would actually be woken up, really gently by a singing bowl, or, another devotee would get up earlier and tap us to wake us up, and very still, to get ready and go into the hall. And you couldn't even have flashlights. All the flashlights were covered with red so that the eye, would not get triggered to come out of the depth. And we'd all go and sit in the hall. And after a while, of course, because everything I did was so exaggerated, he began to address me about the fact that you're making too much noise in the hall. You're wiggling around too much in the hall. Your chair, I can hear your chair. Like I had a seat that was meditation cushion that was placed on a piece of wood that had an upright back, to help maintain the proper asana. And he said, I can hear you wiggling around. And I keep saying to him, but I'm not wiggling. I'm not making noise. We had like a back and forth about this quite a bit. And I really was not aware that I was doing this. And finally, at a certain point, he told me to study Nidra Yoga, and acknowledged that, well, yes, in fact, the depth of my process was I wasn't aware of what the body mind was doing anymore. So as I described, like with being with him while he was sleeping, I was awake because of the force of his transmission, not responsible for it fully yet, but I was aware of it. And so in meditation, the same thing was occurring, was that by virtue of the force of his transmission and the nature in which we were there in his space together, I was absorbed into his consciousness domain. Because it was a Kriya. Whatever was happening was his transmission doing whatever it did, as I was in the depth of his feeling being and being consciousness, contemplating consciousness, merely witnessing what was arising, but then to the point where the body mind fell away. But then one day, after meditation, he was disturbed by the fact that he said, something's not right about this hall, this meditation hall that we're sitting in. Who serves this hall? There's something, it's not clear. And so I think I may have told you this before, but so I was given the honor to purify the hall and to re-prepare it for our meditation together. I love puja. I'm a puja addict. Okay, it's another addiction. And so I went in there and did the gross, subtle, and causal purification, and the, bringing it down and going through every single nook and cranny and his seat and chair and the objects and touching everything and invoking him, and till it felt just rested in. And it was obvious that he had moved again the being to do what was necessary, and the water throwing and the incense burning and the light waving and all of it as a ritual to simply then This is his. This is his. This is the process where he will do his work, and we can feel it and be in it. And then, so later in the day, he was coming back from his library across the square on Naitumba, and we're walking with him, and he decides he wants to go into the hall. And so when he walks into the hall and he stands there with his staff and he's looking around, all around and feeling it, and he said, "Who did this? Who did this puja?" And I said, "I did, beloved." And he said, "Cha, cha." That was a blessing of acknowledging that the puja had been done properly. And this is a moment that we all, as devotees, cherish, because it's not just like being given a pat on the back, like good girl or good boy, but it was that the body had been given over as a true devotee to serve a function for his needs, and the relationship was right. I loved it, and to be able to do that for him in any way possible, and because of this understanding and tapas that he had awakened in me, it sensitized me to the ego act itself as the primary recoil that doesn't enable this vessel in relationship to every aspect of life, whether you're in a sacred hall or not, to be able to serve his purpose, to be in the context of his bright domain as the foundation of the process.
Right, right. So I want to get to the self understanding now. I don't want to exclude, of course, what it is that you've given to the listeners and the watchers and to myself.
Mm.
But the depth of that understanding and the root of that understanding.
Mm. Mm. Yeah.
How is this shown in this? When you see this as moving the devotion, what is it? When does this devotion? When does this devotion turn to that? What is it that the person or the character or the egoic act? How does that egoic act? How was it for you? How was it identified? Where you could turn in the true sense of the word turn to him.
It's entirely feeling discrimination. It's founded in sensitivity to the gift of feeling him.
And so,
and the fist is the eclipsing of that. It's moving away from being yielded into that. And that's the self activity.
And that occurs in consciousness.
Well, yes, in his song, because
right.
Even the bright, and this is why he said this radical understanding is necessary from the very beginning, because it's about no seeking, and everything that the devotee enters into as a process of maturing and adaptation, this fundamental yoga of being in his satsang, which is consciousness, which is the bride itself, is the only context within which that self-understanding can be awakened.
And also the purification process that then follows.
Exactly, yes, because it is his outshining brightness and emergence and presence, spirit presence and being that enables that sufficient necessity for freeing of energy and attention that is bound or locked in identification with the psychophysical arising.
Right, because many times he says this way of the heart or the way of Adidam could be termed the way of purification in
That,
in the beginning stages here. Of course, we're not speaking of the true hearing and seeing levels, if you will, or that part of it, but we're speaking about where this process, which is the preparatory, it's really the preparatory process to the true esoteric aspects of who he is and what the process is involved with.
exactly. A devotee actually, this morning I had received an email or actually just actually a voice memo. And a devotee said to me that she had recently just listened to Beloved speaking, where he was saying that everything prior to the actual entering into the full responsibility for the seventh stage of life, the perfect practice, was all transcending reactivity, transcending this. She said, wow. That really summarizes it. Anything, any recoil in relationship to anything that arises, no matter what the quality is the recoil from the condition that is prior to arising, that is the source condition, the bright. Conscious awareness of the light, unqualified light being modified. That's the domain that you rest in which everything arises.
Now, I want to make a little jump here, and it might be a little late in the discussion, and maybe we could take it to the next time that we talk about this. Is that what holds that barrier between the preparatory, and it is all in consciousness, but there is a level that has to be to move from the preparatory phase to the true hearing and seeing, or the esoteric part. There's fear, fear, and I may be jumping here, as is in the traditions where there's an other, there's fear, meaning that the division that keeps the devotee, or anybody really, in this separative subject-object duality, which is what he was referring to when he was saying you were a predator. You were coming from that subjective place. Underneath it all, there's fear.
Yeah. All of the reactive emotions, and at the root, the fear.
And this is at the gross, the subtle, and the causal, and you could bodily put these in a location, kind of.
Yeah, you can diagram it all out.
Right.
And that has been done. But we all know exactly what it feels like to feel terrified.
Right.
And that fundamental dis-ease of anxiety, disturbance.
Which is the condition.
Unknown.
Which is the condition of the ego itself.
Exactly. That is.
Right.
The fear itself is, yeah. And it is created, that fear is the recoil.
Right.
Because it separates you from the source that is the very thing that is living and breathing you and sustaining everyone and everything that arises. So once that separation is felt, it's the cry, of manifestation, of the sense of separation and identification, and all of the reverberations of that extend from that sense of separate self.
Which goes back in ego time, you're going back to the creation of the universe, but actually the creation of your perceptions of the world and who you are.
Yeah, and it's all like, as we've discussed, it's the microcosm in the macrocosm, and the macrocosm in the microcosm, and it's all manifesting in and being reflected all over the place.
Right.
Yeah. Um, so this separate self and its sense of being separate from truth, the source condition, which is also synchronous with the conscious self, the divine self condition. Yes. And our responsibility in self understanding is to transcend the recoil at the root.
And if I might pick up on an essay we were speaking about earlier, is also not to pin him to a location,
Yeah.
pin him to a spot
Yeah.
on the board of the grid or the board of attention or the board of perception.
Yes, yes, exactly. And that's what you do when you hunt or seek.
Right, right.
Mm,
Well, I think at this point, since I'm looking at the clock and we've been engaged here in the discussion close to almost 50 minutes, I think it would be good to just stop today's discussion and maybe
yeah.
pick it up again tomorrow, the next day, or whenever we can get together.
Yeah. Okay. And maybe I can show you the transcendental cartoon the next time.
Okay, could you give us a little flash before we sign
Okay.
off?
Yes, because this is the context of how he recognizes us. And I won't say anything. I'll just show you, okay?
Okay, all right.
Let's see, get it in there so it's right. Are
Just a
you
high,
seeing?
just a little bit. Okay, turn a little bit to your left. Yeah. So here you have a picture of Quandra
No, my
Surendra
oh
and
yes, Samarpana remembrance, yes.
under remembrance. This is Julie in 1985 on her birthday, painted by Arida and given to Julie as a gift, prasad.
Wow.
So with that, I would like to thank you very much for your time,
Yeah,
and I hope our listeners and watchers have enjoyed it as much as I have.
yeah. Thank you
And
so much.
right, and so until the next time, much love to you and take good care.